I should have known something was wrong when Marcus couldn't look me in the eye during training. The job posting had been too good to be true. $15 an hour to sit in a laundromat overnight, with benefits after 90 days. In a town where most places paid minimum wage, it felt like winning the lottery. I dropped out of college 6 months earlier when my financial aid got cut, and I'd been scraping by with day shifts at the diner ever since. Night work meant I could still pick up lunch shifts when I needed extra money. Suds and Bubbles, 24-hour laundromat, sat on Highway 52, 15 miles from anything resembling civilization. The building squatted in a pool of sickly yellow light, surrounded by darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow sound. Inside, 30 washing machines lined the walls in perfect rows, with 20 dryers stacked above them. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, casting everything in harsh, unflattering shadows. Marcus had worked the night shift for 3 years. He was pale, thin, and had the kind of nervous energy that made you want to check over your shoulder. During my single training shift, he kept glancing at the clock, his hands shaking slightly as he showed me the register system. "It's pretty straightforward," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Most nights are quiet, real quiet. People mostly just want to do their laundry and leave." He handed me a yellowed index card with 6 rules typed on it. The paper felt greasy, like it had been handled by too many sweaty palms. "These are important," Marcus said, and for the first time during training, he looked directly at me. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles underneath. "Really important. Don't think they're suggestions. They're not." I read through the rules quickly. They seemed odd, but every job had its quirks. "What happens if I break one?" I asked. Marcus's face went white. "Don't. But what if I accidentally?" "There are no accidents here," he interrupted. "Only choices. Make the right ones." After my shift ended at 6 a.m., Marcus gathered his things with frantic efficiency. He'd already given his 2 weeks' notice, he told me. Tonight had been his last night. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Somewhere else," he said, not looking back as he walked toward his car. "Anywhere else." I watched his taillights disappear into the dawn, feeling like I'd missed something important. But $15 an hour was $15 an hour, and I needed the money. My first night alone was uneventful. The rules seemed manageable, almost silly. Keep quarters in my left pocket only. Don't open washing machines that were running, but showed no clothes through the window. Direct anyone with a suitcase to machine number 7. The whole thing felt like an elaborate prank. A few customers came and went. A trucker washing his clothes before a long haul. A young mother with a crying baby apologizing for the late hour. Normal people doing normal things. The machines hummed their mechanical lullaby, and I caught up on reading between customers. By my 5th night, I'd settled into a routine. I'd arrive at 10 p.m., count the register, and settle in for 8 hours of mostly nothing. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd always been comfortable with my own thoughts, and the quiet gave me time to think about what I wanted to do with my life. That's when I met my first suitcase customer. He arrived around midnight, an elderly man in a worn brown coat that had seen better decades. He shuffled through the door, dragging a large, old-fashioned suitcase behind him. The wheels squeaked against the linoleum floor, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "Evening," he said, his voice hoarse and dry. "Good evening," I replied, glancing at the suitcase. Rule number 3. Direct anyone with a suitcase to machine number 7. The old man approached the counter, and I caught a smell that made my stomach turn. It was metallic and sweet, like pennies soaked in syrup. He pulled out a roll of quarters and placed them on the counter with deliberate care. "Machine 7, I said, pointing toward the far corner of the laundromat. He nodded and smiled. His teeth were yellow and uneven, and there was something dark stuck between his incisors. "Of course, machine 7. I watched him drag the suitcase across the floor, the squeaking wheels echoing in the empty space. When he reached machine 7, he opened the suitcase with his back to me. I couldn't see what he was loading, but I heard the wet, heavy sounds of fabric hitting the machine's drum. That's when he started humming. It was a low, melodic tune that seemed to resonate through the building. The fluorescent lights flickered in rhythm with the melody, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. The humming continued as he closed the machine and fed it quarters, never breaking the tune even when the wash cycle started. He returned to the counter, still humming, and placed exact change for the wash cycle. His fingers left dark smudges on the bills. He didn't speak, just nodded and walked back to machine 7, where he sat on a plastic chair and continued his musical vigil. For the next hour, I tried to focus on my book, but the humming made concentration impossible. It wasn't just one voice anymore. The washing machines had joined in, their mechanical vibrations matching the old man's tune. The harmony was beautiful and terrible, like a funeral dirge played by a broken music box. When the wash cycle ended, the old man transferred his load to the dryer above machine 7. I still couldn't see what he was drying, but the smell had intensified. My eyes watered, and I had to breathe through my mouth. He left before the dryer finished, dragging his empty suitcase behind him. The door chimed as he exited, and suddenly the building felt normal again. The machines returned to their regular mechanical humming, and the fluorescent lights stopped flickering. I sat there for a long time, staring at machine 7. The dryer continued its cycle, and I found myself counting the rotations visible through the small window. Whatever was inside created strange shadows as it tumbled, shapes that didn't look quite like clothing. When the dryer finally stopped, I waited and waited, but no one came to collect the load. At 6 a.m., When my replacement arrived, I mentioned the unclaimed laundry. Jenny, the day shift supervisor, just nodded. Happens sometimes, she said. Leave it. Someone will deal with it. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her tone suggested the conversation was over. I gathered my things and headed home, trying not to think about the shapes I'd seen tumbling in the dryer. The next few nights were quiet. Normal customers came and went, and I began to think the suitcase incident had been a one-time thing. Then, on my 12th night, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Machines 4, 12, and 18 were running. Their cycles had been going for hours, but when I looked through their windows, I saw nothing but empty drums spinning in the soapy water. According to the rules, I shouldn't open them during a cycle, but I couldn't understand how they'd started running in the first place. I checked the register. No one had paid for those machines. Around 2 a.m., a woman in a stained wedding dress entered the laundromat. Her veil was torn, and her makeup had run in black streaks down her cheeks. She approached the counter with jerky, mechanical movements. "My clothes," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "They're missing." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Which machine did you use?" "4," she said, pointing at one of the empty-looking washers. According to the rules, I should check machines 4, 12, and 18 first when someone complained about missing clothes, but only after they'd stopped completely. The machine was still running. "I'll need to wait for the cycle to finish," I told her. She nodded and stood perfectly still by the counter. She didn't blink, didn't shift her weight, didn't do any of the small, unconscious movements that make people look alive. She just stood there, staring at machine 4 with unblinking eyes. 20 minutes later, the machine stopped. I walked over on unsteady legs and opened the door. Inside, soaking wet and tangled together, was a wedding dress identical to the one the woman was wearing, along with a man's tuxedo. Both were stained with something dark that wasn't dirt. "Found them," I called out, but when I turned around, the woman was gone. I stood there holding the dripping clothes, my hands shaking. The wedding dress was the same style, the same size, even the same tears in the veil. But the woman had been wearing an identical dress when she walked in. I loaded the clothes into a nearby dryer and tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe she'd had a backup dress. Maybe I'd imagined the similarities. But deep down, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The humming started again around 3 a.m. All the machines joined in, creating that same haunting harmony I'd heard on my 5th night. I grabbed the radio from behind the counter and turned it on, flooding the laundromat with static and late-night talk radio. The humming stopped immediately. I kept the radio on for the rest of my shift. By my 20th night, I developed a system. I followed the rules exactly, never deviating, never asking questions. When the empty machines ran, I let them run. When customers brought suitcases, I directed them to machine 7 without making eye contact. When the humming started, I turned on the radio. It was working until the night a customer asked for fabric softener. She was young, maybe 18, with stringy blonde hair and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. She approached the counter around 1 a.m., moving with the careful steps of someone who'd been drinking. "Excuse me," she whispered, leaning close to the bulletproof glass. "Do you have any fabric softener?" The request itself wasn't unusual. We kept travel-sized bottles behind the counter for customers who forgot to bring their own. But the way she asked, in that breathy whisper, made my skin crawl. According to the rules, I should never sell fabric softener to anyone who asked for it in a whisper. But I could sell the regular priced stuff. The special fabric softener was locked in a cabinet I'd never opened. "I have some right here," I said, reaching for the small bottles we kept on the shelf. She shook her head. "Not that kind, the special kind. The kind that makes things soft forever." I stared at her through the glass. Her eyes were completely black, no iris or pupil visible, just endless darkness that seemed to pull at my vision. "I don't know what you mean," I said. She smiled, and her teeth were too sharp. "You do, you have it. I can smell it from here." My hands trembled as I reached for the locked cabinet. Inside, there was a single bottle of fabric softener, but it was wrong. The liquid inside was too dark, too thick, and it seemed to move on its own, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at. "How much?" I asked. "No charge," she whispered. "It's already paid for." I handed her the bottle through the money slot. She took it with hands that were too cold, too pale, and her fingers felt like ice through my skin. She unscrewed the cap and took a deep breath, her eyes rolling back in her head. "Perfect," she said, and walked away without another word. I watched her pour the liquid into one of the washing machines, but I couldn't see which one. The lights flickered, and for a moment, every machine in the laundromat was running at once. The noise was deafening, a mechanical symphony that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Then silence. Every machine had stopped. The fluorescent lights steadied. The only sound was my own rapid breathing and the distant hum of the radio I'd forgotten to turn off. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every sound, but nothing else happened. When Jenny arrived for the day shift, I tried to tell her about the strange customer, but she just shrugged. "Some people are weird," she said. "As long as they're not causing trouble, it's not our problem." But I knew it was my problem. I was the one who'd given her the bottle. I was the one who'd broken the unspoken rule about recognizing specific situations. I just didn't know what I'd done wrong. The answer came on my 30th night. I'd been working at Suds and Bubbles for a month, and I thought I'd seen everything the place had to offer. I was wrong. The customer walked in around midnight, and I recognized him immediately. He was the same elderly man who'd brought the suitcase on my fifth night. Same brown coat, same shuffling walk, same squeaking suitcase. But something was different. He looked exactly the same, down to the dark stains on his teeth and the smell of metal and sweetness that followed him. Two exactly the same. He approached the counter with the same deliberate movements, placed the same roll of quarters in the same spot, and smiled with the same yellow teeth. "Machine 7, I said before he could speak. He nodded. "Of course, Machine 7. I watched him drag the suitcase across the floor, and I swear the squeaking wheels made the exact same pattern of sounds as before. When he reached Machine 7, he opened the suitcase and began loading it with the same wet, heavy sounds. That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't just a similar customer. This was the same customer doing the same thing in the same way. He was repeating his visit from 25 nights ago, like a recording being played back. He started humming the same tune, and the machines joined in with the same harmony. I grabbed the radio, but hesitated. What if interrupting the pattern was worse than letting it continue? I decided to let it play out. The old man sat in the same plastic chair, humming the same melody while his load went through the wash cycle. When it finished, he transferred everything to the dryer and left with his empty suitcase. But this time, I was ready. I walked over to Machine 7 and looked through the dryer's window. What I saw made me stagger backward. My hand clamped over my mouth to keep from screaming. Inside the dryer, tumbling in the heated air, were body parts. Arms, legs, a torso, all wrapped in what might have once been clothing. But they weren't decomposing. They were clean, perfectly preserved, as if they'd been washed in something that prevented decay. The special fabric softener, the kind that makes things soft forever. I ran back to the counter and grabbed the phone, but there was no dial tone. The lines were dead. My cell phone showed no signal, even though I'd had full bars when I arrived. I was trapped in the laundromat with a dryer full of human remains and no way to call for help. The next few hours passed in a blur of terror and confusion. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally, but my mind kept returning to the impossible sight in the dryer. Every time I looked over at Machine 7, I could see the shapes tumbling inside, and I had to fight the urge to run screaming into the night. Around 3 a.m., more customers began arriving. A woman in a blood-stained wedding dress, a trucker with hollow eyes, a young mother carrying a bundle that didn't move like a baby. One by one, they entered the laundromat and began going through the motions of doing laundry. But none of them were washing clothes. I watched in horror as they loaded machines with things that shouldn't be washed. The trucker fed something that looked like photographs into Machine 12, but the pictures showed places that hurt to look at. The young mother placed her bundle in Machine 18, and I heard sounds coming from inside that weren't mechanical. and they all hummed the same tune, the same melody that had haunted my nights for weeks. I turned on the radio, but it only made things worse. The static began forming patterns, voices that whispered things I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were terrible. I turned it off and let the humming continue. That's when I understood the truth about suds and bubbles. This wasn't just a laundromat. It was a way station, a place where things that shouldn't exist came to be cleaned, processed, and prepared for whatever came next. The rules weren't about keeping customers happy or maintaining equipment. They were about containing something that was far beyond my comprehension. And I was the attendant, the guardian, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly. The customers continued their business throughout the night, never speaking to each other, never acknowledging my presence. They were all focused on their tasks, washing things that had no business being washed, drying things that should never have gotten wet. As dawn approached, they began to leave. One by one, they gathered their loads and walked back out into the darkness. The woman in the wedding dress was last, and she paused at the door to look back at me. "Thank you," she said, her voice hollow and distant, "for keeping the rules." Then she was gone, and I was alone with the humming machines and the fluorescent lights that had seen too much. Jenny arrived at 6 a.m. as usual, but she looked different. Older, more tired, like she'd aged years overnight. "How was your shift?" she asked. "Fine," I said, because what else could I say? That I'd spent the night watching the dead do their laundry. That I now understood why Marcus had left town without looking back. She nodded and began her opening routine. "Good, same time tomorrow." I wanted to say no. I wanted to quit, to walk away, to pretend none of this had happened. But I thought about the rules, about the careful balance that kept whatever this place contained from spilling out into the world. "Yes," I said, "same time tomorrow." I drove home through the morning light, trying to process what I'd experienced. The rational part of my mind insisted that I'd imagined everything, that working nights had made me paranoid and delusional. But the smell of metal and sweetness still clung to my clothes, and I could still hear the echo of that terrible humming in my ears. That evening, I almost didn't go back. I sat in my car outside the laundromat for 20 minutes, watching the yellow light spill across the empty parking lot. I could have driven away, found another job, started fresh somewhere else. But I thought about Marcus, about the way he'd looked at me during training. The desperation in his eyes, the relief when he'd finally been able to leave. He'd done his time, followed the rules, kept the balance. Now it was my turn. I got out of the car and walked through the door. The 31st night was quiet. Normal customers came and went, and I began to hope that the previous night had been an aberration. Maybe the pattern only repeated once a month. Maybe I could handle this if it was predictable. I was wrong. Around midnight, a new customer entered. He was tall, thin, and moved with the same mechanical precision I'd seen in the folders. But he wasn't carrying a laundry basket. He was carrying a briefcase. "Good evening," he said, his voice perfectly modulated. "Good evening," I replied, checking the rules. There was nothing about briefcases. He approached machine 13, a washer I'd never seen anyone use. He opened the briefcase and began removing items that I couldn't quite focus on. They seemed to shift and blur when I looked directly at them, like they existed in a frequency my eyes couldn't process. "Excuse me," I called out. "You need to pay at the counter first." He turned to look at me, and I saw that his face was perfectly symmetrical in a way that human faces never are. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright. "I have a standing account," he said, and returned to his task. I watched him load the invisible items into the machine and start the cycle. The washer began running, but it made no sound. The drum turned silently, and the water that filled it wasn't water. It was something darker, thicker, that moved like oil, but reflected light like mercury. For the next hour, I sat frozen behind the counter, afraid to move or speak. The tall man stood perfectly still beside machine 13, never shifting his weight, never blinking. He was like a statue, a monument to something I couldn't understand. When the cycle finished, he transferred his load to the dryer above. I still couldn't see what he was drying, but the machine began to glow with a soft, blue light that made my eyes water. The light pulsed in rhythm with something I couldn't identify, like a heartbeat made of photons. He left before the dryer finished, taking his empty briefcase with him. The door chimed as he exited, and the blue light faded to normal. But machine 13 continued running, cycle after cycle, never stopping. I realized then that some customers never came back for their loads. They left things behind, things that the machines processed endlessly, breaking them down and building them back up in patterns that served purposes I couldn't fathom. The laundromat wasn't just a way station. It was a factory, producing something that the world needed but could never acknowledge. And I was part of the production line, following rules that kept the machinery running smoothly. Over the following weeks, I saw more customers like the tall man. They came with briefcases, suitcases, packages wrapped in materials that hurt to look at. They used machines I'd never noticed before, machines that seemed to appear when they were needed and disappear when they weren't. I learned to recognize the folders, the whisperers, the ones who hummed. Each group had its own purpose, its own role in the complex ecology of the laundromat. And I was the attendant, the one who made sure they could do their work without interference. The rules became second nature. I stopped questioning them, stopped trying to understand them. I simply followed them day after day, night after night, maintaining the balance that kept everything running smoothly. Sometimes, in the quiet hours between customers, I would think about my old life, college, friends, plans for the future. They seemed like memories from someone else's life, distant and unreal. This was my reality now: fluorescent lights, humming machines, and customers who weren't quite human. I thought about Marcus, about where he'd gone when he left. Had he found peace? Had he been able to forget what he'd seen? Or was he somewhere else, following different rules, maintaining a different balance? I thought about the day shift workers, about Jenny, and the others who came in when the sun was up. Did they know what happened at night? Did they see the stains that couldn't be cleaned, smell the odors that lingered despite the ventilation system? Or were they like I'd been in the beginning, blind to the truth that hid in plain sight? The answer came on my 60th night. I'd been working at Suds and Bubbles for 2 months, and I thought I'd adapted to the routine. I was wrong. Jenny arrived early that morning before dawn. She looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me count the register. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 2 months, I said. She nodded. Same as Marcus. Same as the one before him. Same as the one before that. What happened to them? They moved on, she said. Found other work. Different shifts. Everyone moves on eventually. What about you? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've been here longer. Day shift has its own rules. Different customers, different needs, but the same purpose. She walked over to machine 7 and opened the dryer that had been running since my first suitcase customer. Inside, instead of the preserved remains I'd seen that night, was a neat pile of clean laundry. Normal clothes, perfectly folded, ready for pickup. It's all about perspective, she said. What you see depends on when you're looking. I stared at the clothes, trying to reconcile them with what I'd witnessed. Are they real? Everything here is real, she said. But real doesn't mean what you think it means. She closed the dryer and walked back to the counter. Your replacement will be here tonight. A young man, eager to work, needs the money. I'll train him just like I trained Marcus, just like I trained you. I'm not leaving, I said. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. Yes, you are. You've done your time, followed the rules, kept the balance. Now it's someone else's turn. I wanted to argue, to insist that I could stay, that I understood the job better than anyone. But I knew she was right. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, the way the humming machines sounded more distant. My time was up. That night, I trained my replacement. His name was David, and he was young, eager, and desperate for work. Just like I'd been 2 months ago. I handed him the yellowed index card with the 6 rules, and I watched his face as he read them. What happens if I break one? He asked. I looked at him. This young man who reminded me so much of myself, and I gave him the same answer Marcus had given me. Don't. After my shift ended, I gathered my things and walked to my car. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The laundromat sat in its pool of yellow light, looking exactly as it had on my first night. I drove away without looking back. I found new work, day shift at a different job. Normal hours, normal customers, normal problems. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I would hear the sound of machines humming in harmony, and I would remember the rules that kept the balance. I never drove past suds and bubbles again. I didn't want to know if David was still there, still following the rules, still maintaining the balance. I didn't want to know what had become of the customers who weren't quite human, or the loads that were never picked up. Some knowledge is too heavy to carry, but sometimes, late at night, I would think about the laundromat and the work that happened there. The endless cycle of washing and drying, cleaning and processing, breaking down and building up. I would think about the rules that seemed arbitrary, but served a purpose I couldn't understand. And I would be grateful that someone was still there, still following the rules, still keeping the balance, because some things need to be washed clean, even if we don't understand why. And someone has to mind the machines while they work. The spin cycle never stops. It just finds new attendants to watch over it. And the rules remain the same.